All right, welcome everybody. I see that it's 5 o'clock South African time. And I think we are then ready to kick off the next session. Let me share my screen. Right, as I said, it is 5 o'clock, so let us stick to time and kick off straight away. I came in right at the very end, but that musical performance sounded amazing, so it's a stunning way for us to start the next session. Thank you for sharing that. And welcome everyone from around the world as we continue LCT 3.5. A warm welcome to everyone for session 49. We would like to disrupt the dichotomy and talk about our experiences on how LCT moves us beyond the theory. This session will be focusing on the semantics dimension and how the theory versus practice divide plays out for each of the presenters in the session. Just for some quick background, we are from the WITS LCT Hub Research Unit, run by our director, Professor Lee Rusniak. And the presenters in tonight's session all form part of this wonderful community of practice. We meet every Wednesday from 2:30 until 4 South African time, and it's all about LCT and how it applies to everybody in 1,000 million different ways. So it is a very exciting and vibrant community of practice. So this session looks at semantic shifts in specific sort of areas. So we have structured our presentations rather like an upside down pyramid that you can see here, with the first presenter having a very broad macro discussion of semantic shifts in an entire field of practice. And that is going to be the field of practice of insurance. Thereafter, we narrow it down into semantic shifts in particular subjects, with the subject of music. Then we have semantic shifts in problem solving a particular tasks, or a particular task in robotics coding. And we end off with semantic shifts in teacher-student interaction, with firstly talking teaching, and we're ending off with some poetic devices. So yeah, we hope that you all enjoy session 49. So here we can see a graphical representation of the semantics plane, just a quick snapshot of where our presentations are going to be at. All of our presentations will be looking at shifts around the semantic plane at the different scales. So the red ball moving on the screen, sort of across the plane, are some of the shifts that we will be discussing. So we use semantic gravity and semantic density to look at shifts in context dependence and shifts in complexity of meaning. So I hope we can show that the LCT dimension of semantics can be used with a macro as well as a very micro paintbrush. And without further ado, I think let us move on to the first presentation. So my name is Agata MacGregor, and I'm in the field of insurance and risk management at Wits University. And I would like to explore the macro changes that are currently taking place in our field. So I'm not looking at any particular course or assessment, but rather at the industry as a whole. So it's a very macro and very preliminary perspective. Okay, so to give a little bit of background, to become a broker, for example, in insurance, you do not need to have a tertiary education. So you can go straight out of matric into Hollard, let's say, and they will teach you all that you need to know to be a broker. That is generally how our industry has progressed. So our governing body does offer some proficiency courses, which are encouraged to be taken, but no formal degree is a compulsory requirement. So not like a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. And this I find very interesting because the question that comes up in my mind is, why can we not offer an insurance degree? Just like a law degree or medical degree, an engineering degree. Are we not professionals in our own field as well? And in the year 2020, so about 2 years ago now, we had a shift in our industry along those lines. All our governing bodies, and we have so many of them, so it's quite nice to get them all to communicate, finally got together and agreed on an accepted body of knowledge for our industry. So we finally had consensus on what an insurance professional needs to know, which for me is very exciting, which gave rise to this presentation. I also would like to say that I bumped into LCT, and I say that because I think LCT found me as opposed to me finding it. It came to me at the right time. I was looking for a lens that I could use to show this shift in our industry, moving from practical on-the-job training to a more formalized curriculum, and the semantics dimension offered that opportunity. So here I have pulled some extracts from a historical text written on South African insurance education. From these quotes, it can be seen that there was a primary focus on the job training and how to teach the practicalities of insurance through short courses and workshops. These were taught in silos specific to the area of work that a practitioner was in. So a marine broker, for example, would only attend workshops on marine insurance. Words such as vocational guidance, promote sound practical knowledge, offer advice on a product. So our knowledge is therefore rather segmented, I would say. As a practitioner in our field, you enter the workplace in a specific role and you focus your learning on that role. So the focus was on sound practical insurance knowledge. So in summary, I think we promoted experiential learning with a weaker semantic density. Now, if I were to place this on a semantics plane, I would place our insurance industry education predominantly within the prosaic code, where we have meanings that are strongly bound to the context of each individual within their particular job description. So our education followed this on-the-job training model up until around 94. Then in 1994, legislation was passed saying that our governing body could no longer teach and accredit insurance at the same time. So their ability to perpetuate knowledge was therefore halted by legislation. So suddenly we had many new interested parties, many new interested professional bodies started getting involved in our insurance education, and they were offering courses. So over time, the question for us became, what is the agreed upon body of knowledge for our industry in South Africa? And WITS entered the conversation in 2020, and an agreement was reached on using the WITS curriculum as the industry agreed upon body of knowledge. So this curriculum's focus is not on the job training, but rather on showing how insurance is grounded in theory and providing a theoretical underpinning to our discipline. So here for me was quite an important shift. 2020 was a specific point in time that really, in my view, is going to make a big difference for our industry. So now here we have extracts from our current course packs. The language to me has changed. So if we compare it to the previous slide with the quotes as well, it is now becoming more technically and theoretically grounded, more abstract. It articulates connections and links between various fields of insurance. So we grounded our discipline in law and in economics to make it fit better within a BCom degree. We are part of the Commerce Law and Management faculty. And that is coming through quite strongly here. We are now using legal and economic principles to show how they are used in our industry. So we still have a practical and application element to it. So we are keeping the experiential learning, which is very important, but we are overlaying that with theory. So I would therefore argue we are now in a position to move from segmented knowledge building to cumulative knowledge building as students progress through this curriculum. So now, if we plot this change on the same semantics plane, it gives us the opportunity for some movement between the prosaic code to also move into the rhizomatic as well as the wordly code. So with this underpinning of theory, we are given the opportunity to take what has been learned in practice and be able to make complex. So I think in conclusion, historically, I would say we were in a semantic flatline. And the agreement of accepting the WITS curriculum in 2020 has allowed for us to move out of that flatline, travel up an escalator to allow for semantic waves to start taking place. So as we start incorporating the practical with the theoretical concepts, we can allow our students to experience both. As to the implications of such a shift, honestly, I don't know how to answer that right now. But I see it strengthening the technical knowledge in the industry. So as the older generation retires, so much of what they have learned on the job leaves with them. So this may be a way to strengthen that again. It can allow individuals in the field the ability to move between career tracks perhaps easier. So a broker can move into underwriting, or an individual in car insurance can move to health insurance much easier, because they would hold the same theoretical sort of threshold concepts, for example. So for me, this may have a very positive effect for our industry over time. And I'm quite excited to continue sort of exploring these areas using LCT. That's it from my side. Thank you, everyone. I would like now to pass over to our second presenter, Mandy, who will take us through how she has experienced semantic shifts in her subject of music. So over to you, Mandy.
Hi, everybody. So yes, I'm going to talk about music. And after teaching music for about 30 years, I stopped to do a PhD, to take a break from the classroom. And once I'd encountered LCT and this particular concept of semantic gravity, I suddenly found an explanation of a problem that I'd found in my teaching all the way through. So thanks, Agata. We'll have the next slide. So let me introduce you to my 16-year-old self. I know I haven't changed, thanks for saying so, but I learned to play the guitar when I was 16. I didn't have any formal training. I didn't know anything about music. And so, and in fact, this is the guitar that I learned on. And what I was doing was I was putting, okay, you need to put this finger here and this finger here, and then you've got a G chord, and then you've got to put this finger here and this finger here, and that's an E chord. And so I was learning chords as random finger patterns, and then I'd have songs. You've probably seen them before. Words of the songs written out with the chords written in capital letters or little letters across the top. So the songs I learned were a sort of random group of chords in my head. Which finger goes on which string, on which word in the song must I change the chord. And that's how I learned to play the guitar. And I didn't do too badly, actually. I was a good singer. So I ended up, by the time I was 18, I was singing in bars and restaurants. And, you know, I've learned some stuff. Thanks. Can we have the next slide? Zoom forward to years later, and I was a music teacher with lots and lots of singing students. And my teenage singers would come in and they'd say to me, hey, Mrs. Carver, I've learned to play a song. I've learned to play an Adele song on the piano. It was always Adele because teenage girls love Adele. So Agata, if you would just press our sound button and I'll talk as it plays. So they were always girls, and they would come in and I'd invite them to my piano and say, okay, can you play for me? So this is Rolling in the Deep, and this is the sort of thing that I would hear. So the girls had learned to play by imitation or by rote. They had had a friend say to them, put your finger here, play this note, then that note with that finger, and then play that pattern 4 times, and then move down to the left, and then play this pattern 4 times, and then change, and then play that one again. And so they would rely on their ear, because their ear would, you know, they'd have an oral idea of what the song sounded like. And also their eyes, as they would watch the keyboard and think, okay, which note comes next? But this, like me playing the guitar, was a very embodied process. It's about manipulating the instrument. It's about making the right sounds. And if the girls got stuck, which they often did, they would have to start again and go back to the beginning. So let's go to the next slide. So if they wanted to learn another song, my Adele pianists would need to learn in the same way. They would have their friend teach them note by imitation, how to play the song, how the notes worked out. And for me as a young guitarist, I would build up a repertoire of chords that I knew, and I'd play my songs from the chord charts. And in this way, it's a little bit like paint by numbers. You know, those pictures where if there's a section that says 3, you paint green, and if it's 5, you paint red, and if it's 1, you use white paint. And you don't really have any sense of how perspective works or color works, you're just following the instructions and you're putting in the right color in the right place. In the same way, I was putting in a chord that I had no insight into in the right place, and it would work with the song. So the knowledge for both myself and for my Adele pianist was really context dependent. It was something that I could play this song, maybe I could play quite well, but I couldn't apply my knowledge to something that was new and different. So let's go on to the next step here. In order to be able to apply knowledge, in order for the knowledge to be context independent, I needed access to the systems that underpin music. So that is much weaker semantic gravity. So for pianists, they need an understanding of how scales work and how melodies work within scales, intervals, which are the spaces between notes, what sizes they are and how they work within scales, concepts about time, how harmony works, which notes go together, which chords go together. And some of this conceptual stuff would be shared by guitarists. So for a guitarist, they need to understand what the fretboard is. So each one of these, a string pressed down on each one of these places, a different note. What the notes have names, they go together to make chords. The chords fit into keys. If I want more complex chords, I might have more interesting sounding chords. So these are the systems that are very consistent and very stable, and they hold music together. So in order to have a context-independent knowledge, a pianist or a guitarist, a learner needs to start getting access to those systems of knowledge. So let's move on to the next slide. So within music education, we've got, within the broader international conversation about the philosophy of music education, actually hinges on this very issue. There's a camp that says that music education should be about learning. It should be about learning to play, about experience, about sound, about playing, about physical involvement in the instrument, at the cost of theoretical conceptual stuff, which frankly is difficult. And many kids are quite alienated by theory, by music theory, because it's difficult and it's very different to the reason that music kids are motivated to play music. They didn't really want to start learning music so that they could start thinking about theory. So often theory can be quite alienating, or the concepts can be quite alienated, especially in the way it's been taught traditionally. But that high semantic flat line on its own is no good. And also the low semantic flat line is no good. Neither one can really work without the other. And so the key, and if we just go to the next slide, last one, I think, is the semantic wave. And this was my aha. And so I've known this as a teacher, that in order to really get my kids to learn to build their knowledge, that they needed to have that relationship and be able to join the dots between the two. But the concept of the semantic wave was a beautiful explanation of the very issue in theory. So we build our knowledge by joining the dots between what music sounds like, how it feels to play it, and those structures that are so common in music that hold the whole thing together, and building our knowledge of those at the same time and making sure that there's a line in between. So that's me, and let's go on to Dorian.
Hi, thanks, Mandy. Well, my problem was very similar, how to bridge the gap between high semantic flatlines, what is very much seen as a problem in computer education, that it's way too abstract and way too difficult for students. So in primary school, kids play with things and they create with digital technology, and they express themselves with digital technology. When they get to high school, suddenly they're expected to do all this difficult abstract coding. And how the hell do you bridge that gap? Well, physical computing seems on the face of it to offer one possible solution. And that is that if kids are allowed to tinker with devices, and if they're allowed to explore coding through block code, where you don't have to write it as command line text editing, to create the code. You just drag blocks into place. It's far more embodied, far more physical, and maybe that will allow them to acquire the concepts, which will later enable them to move on to the level of abstraction and the level of complexity that they need. So my question was, could me as a teacher, could an understanding of the semantic plane help me to teach middle school kids to be able to start bridging this gap? Next slide, please. So looking at a particular task, if we could play the video. This is a robot, and this robot has been programmed, the microbit chip has been programmed using block code. And all term, the students have been learning how to program this particular chip. And then now what they're doing is they set a challenge how to get this robot out of the maze. So they've got to write code which will allow the robot to move through the maze and then ultimately escape it. So it's got to avoid the obstacles, it's got to avoid the walls of the maze and move forward and get through the code. So next slide, please. A great fun, by the way, and lots of excitement. So we're trying to bridge the gap really between everyday knowledge and understanding that students have to the more abstract and complex type of academic knowledge that they need to be able to code. Next slide, please. And very much this is a gap between, on the one hand, kind of physical hands-on tinkering with machinery, and then the kind of abstract command line programming that they need. So next slide, please. So how would I, as a teacher, be able to help them cover this gap? Quite clearly, you can't jump straight from the prosaic code straight to the rhizomatic code. That's never going to work. So you either have to move them, go for more complexity. So you've got to build on ideas, introduce some concepts that will help them raise the level of complexity in their coding. Or next slide, please, move it the other way. You've got to teach them how to introduce some abstraction, move into the rarefied code before moving into the rhizomatic code. And as a teacher, you try to, in terms of instructional design, I was trying to plot these paths to introduce a concept here, introduce another concept there, to enable them to start making these shifts from the prosaic code into the worldly or the rarefied code, back again, and then finally trying to end them up in the rhizomatic code. In terms of programming, of course, there is no such, there is no natural superiority in the rhizomatic code. If you're doing a simple program, it can be simple, but most programs require a level of complexity and a level of abstraction. Next code, please. So I developed a kind of really rough and ready translation device that I was able to use on the spot in the classroom. So when thinking about semantic gravity, for example, using global variables is one way in which you can weaken semantic gravity. So a global variable is declared at the beginning. So at the beginning of the program, you say the distance is going to be 15, the pause is going to be 300, the speed is going to be 150. And then whenever it's encountered in the program, then it will use that variable. So it crosses context, if you like. And students tend to use local variables. So in the one at the bottom with a stronger semantic gravity, you can see that this student has set the speed of the motor at 255. Instead of setting the speed at the beginning of the program, each time speed is needed to be set, they will assign a particular value to it. Next slide, please. And of course, I also had to have a translation device for semantic density. So most beginner programs, their programs will be very sequential, very linear. So they will do one step at a time. They'll turn them one motor forward, one motor backward, set the pause, etc. But what you really need to be able to do to get a robot through a maze is to use conditionals. You've got to use nested conditionals. You've got to use functions and things like that, which condense meaning in very complex ways. So for example, the state of the turn I've assigning a random true or false value. And then if the turn is true, one thing happens, otherwise something else will happen. Next slide, please. So what this allowed me to do was, as I moved around the class, I could almost tell kind of instinctually, because I was thinking in terms of semantic gravity and semantic density, I could kind of see almost instantaneously where the student was on the plane. And that enabled me as a teacher to be able to give better feedback and see where they were in their own learning path. Because as much as the instructional design might have taught them, for example, how to set a global variable, when they come to the next task, and they might do it for that task because you've taught them how to do it, when it comes to the next task, where you are now moving on to a different concept, they don't always transfer that knowledge across. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. And as you walk around, you want to remind them that, okay, a very useful heuristic, I would say, this student is quite clearly in the prosaic codes. So I need to do something just to shift them that little bit to improve their coding. Next slide, please. And just to give a few examples, and if we could whip through these codes quite clearly, I mean, the moment you see some global variable set, you know you're talking about a rarefied code, and you don't have to worry about giving feedback about that. And now you're looking for, is there more complexity here? So do I need to give feedback about that? Next slide, please. And a lot of coding takes place in the worldly code. So coding tends to be rather more complex than it does tend to be abstract. So as long as you see a student using, for example, conditional loops, using nested loops and things as they are here, you're pretty happy. But what you really want to see is them adding functions, because functions will shorten their code. Quite literally, you can define a function in one part of the program and then call it up in another part of the program, which of course is also a level of abstraction because it rises above particular context. So next slide, please. The moment you see that happening, you know that you've managed to get them into the rhizomatic code. And the code you see here would pretty much be model code for getting the robot out of the maze. And last slide, please. So how would I use this as a teacher? Well, if I'm walking around and I see, we've got a nested if, so I just check to make sure that they've done it right. And if they haven't, I can help them fine tune it. So I can see that quite successfully they've used condensation. And so now my mind is focusing as a teacher, specifically, what do I need to do? Now I probably want them to move it to a greater level of abstraction. So I can start looking at their code and saying, I see you've set the speed. Look how many times you've done it. You're setting the speed to 255, 255, 255, 255. Is there a better way of doing this? And then you challenge the student to think, okay, well, what did you do a couple of lessons ago? Remember when we declared our variables at the beginning of the code? Could you do that here? And there's kind of aha moment of the student. So I found that using the concepts of semantic gravity and density, very, very useful as a kind of heuristic teaching tool, both for planning learning paths and for seeing where students were kind of straying from the learning path, trying to come back onto the learning path, and trying to guide them along to make their code more abstract and more complex. And on to Dale.
Thanks so much, Dorian. It's really interesting to see how you used LCT to give really authentic feedback to your learners and how it helped you to shape your thoughts, to make your feedback accessible to your learners. So, I mean, it's really clear that as a teacher, you draw on a whole lot of different kinds of knowledge to make decisions in your classroom. And when you're teaching and evaluating the efficacy of your teaching, so these different knowledges can be drawn from particular teaching contexts or from more abstracted ideas such as education theory. And this is where semantic gravity is useful to understand what different kinds of knowledges enable or shut down. So in this instance, I'm going to be talking about how different types of knowledge enable the teacher to move between the different teaching and learning contexts in which they may find themselves. If you could just click for me, please, Agata. So when the semantic gravity of the knowledge on which a teacher draws to make decisions is stronger, they're drawing on knowledge of a particular teaching context. So this enables them to make really good responsive decisions about the specific context in which they find themselves, such as, these are the needs of these children, this is the kind of pedagogy that I'm going to have to use in this classroom. But it may make it more difficult if they're required to switch to another context where the conditions under which they are teaching are different. If you can click again for me, please, Agata. So in the semantic gravity of the knowledge, Agata, can you click for me? Thank you. So in the semantic gravity of the knowledge on which the teacher's drawing to make those decisions is weaker, they're drawing on knowledge of abstracted ideas and principles of teaching, which enables them to make responsive decisions about the specific context in which they're teaching by bringing the abstracted ideas to bear.
Today. Pretty awesome day on the parkway.
And because they're able to bring those the abstracted principles of teaching in to make sense of the different teaching contexts, they are then able to take these universal principles and apply them in any context in which they find themselves. So that's quite interesting, but what I've gone and done now is set up a binary between weaker and stronger semantic gravity, which is really not the aim of what we're trying to do today. We're trying to bridge theory and practice. So maybe some examples of what I'm talking about might show us a way to bridge this gap. Can I have the next slide, please? So take this example of what could be set up, the conditions that make sense for teachers to be able to make sense of teaching and learning contexts. So I did an experiment in which I asked these differently qualified beginner teachers to discuss the same video of another student teacher teaching a lesson. So the blue group were discussing with one another, and they really focus on the contextual, they really unpack the particular context in which the lesson's happening in incredible detail. But they didn't tend to bring in any ideas from outside of the context to make sense of the context. They shared the video, they'd all seen the same video, so they spoke about what they saw in terms of the context of the video. So when you're talking about teaching and you're thinking about teaching, a focus on the specifics is useful in the particular context, but it's not really very useful to make sense of any other teaching context. Whereas if we can have the next slide, the green group's participants really showed significant waving between the more abstracted principles and a contextualized conversation. And that's because they developed this shared language of practice. They'd all studied the same program at the same institution. And so they had this shared language to repeatedly bring theory to bear on the practice that they'd observed. And so they could pick up what the last person was saying and link it to a new idea, perhaps a theoretical idea, and then give an example from the video, and then link that to another theoretical idea and give another example to illustrate what they were meaning. And this group of participants had been actively encouraged through their whole teacher preparation, their whole degree, to deliberately articulate their reasoning and discuss, consistently discuss their thinking about why they think this way of teaching is better than that for this particular lesson, and so on and so forth. So they are used to bringing these abstracted principles to make sense of particular teaching contexts. And when we can think and talk about teaching, and we have access to those abstracted theoretical ideas, we have the ability to transfer those insights over context and time. So if we then compare the two on the next slide, please, Agata. If we compare those two, we can start to see what is the semantic gravity analysis of these two examples shown us. So semantic gravity has but it also has given us a way of getting to the heart of what makes these knowledges different. What makes theoretical knowledge different to more contextualized knowledge, and what they kind of enable or constrain. And because we saw that the green group and the blue groups show different semantic waving, we can look at what enables or constrains that repeated semantic waving. If you can click for me, please, Agata. For the blue group, observing and talking about this particular context that they observed was all about giving practical tips and techniques and discussing those with one another. If you can click again, please. So they don't seem to have this shared language from outside of the observed lesson to bear on their observations. They haven't studied together. They don't know what the other person has studied in their undergraduate course. And so this kind of conversation, I would say, does very little to bridge that theory-practice divide. Theory belongs in my coursework, practical stuff belongs in the real classroom, and ne'er the twain shall meet. Whereas, if you could click again for me, please. On the other hand, the green group repeatedly brought that theory to bear on the practice, linking the practice that they observed to relevant theoretical insights. And if you could click one last time for me, please. Because they had this shared language, there was significant waving between the stronger semantic gravity and weaker semantic gravity. And I believe that it's this semantic waving that we're seeing that bridges that theory-practice divide in teacher education. So this is how I see it. Semantic gravity has given me the tools to see what makes different knowledges different, and how deliberate, sustained movement between them to create this shared language of practice enables us to actively and deliberately bridge the theory-practice divide in the field of initial teacher education. And now Zaheera is going to take the conversation further to do with poetry in young childhood.
Thanks so much, Dale. Good afternoon, everybody. I don't know if it's good afternoon or morning. In this presentation, I address the nuanced work that teachers do to get learners to work independently. Next slide, please. So the data from this research comes from a creative writing course that was developed during the pandemic. And it's an online mentorship. It spans 20 days and there's 20 minutes per day where we work one-on-one with learners, where we teach them figurative language devices like alliteration and metaphors, similes, that kind of thing, and with the intention of learners using these devices to write stories. Next slide, please. So this unit, the whole unit of the 20 days, fits as semantic waves. And these semantic waves are, the teacher firstly introduces the creative writing device at a very low semantic gravity, then unpacks the different creative writing devices. Then the learners use the creative writing devices in a text, or they use it using a game. Then the teacher gets the learners to create their own devices, and the teacher gets the learners to use the devices intentionally in their own creative writing. So this data comes from a grade 3 lesson. I'm now going to show you a little bit, a snippet from a video from one of the lessons. In this lesson, the teacher is working with a grade 3 learner, and you'll see at the end of the lesson where the learner is actually calling out, she's reading out sentences that she developed on her own using similes. Then the teacher launches into a description and explanation of what a metaphor is. And the learner hones in on the word was as more of a technical descriptor than a conceptual one. And the teacher works with the learner to work on that misconception. Next slide, please.
My mommy's cheeks is as soft as a rose petal. She is as caring as a nurse.
Okay, so she obviously takes good care of you. Okay, so now so that was all similes. A metaphor is a figure of speech, and we also use it to compare things, right? But it's different to a simile, because a simile you usually use like or as, and with a metaphor, we don't use like or as. All these things that you are learning are your tools. So for your writer's toolbox, right? So these are all ways you can engage your reader and help them imagine things in their heads. So the best way we can understand what is being said at is we're going to look at examples. I'm going to read it for you. And when you think you hear a metaphor, you tell me, stop. I woke up on Saturday morning with a toothache. Mom said the tooth was a deep red volcano. Mom helped me rinse my mouth with warm salt water, and then I gargled, and when I gargled, I choked. So do you see any metaphors yet? So remember what we said, to identify them.
Was a deep volcano?
Yes, because you're comparing the tooth to a volcano.
Must I underline the was?
Yes, you must underline was a deep red volcano. The dentist's chair was a submarine, and it dropped lower and lower.
Was the dentist's chair was a submarine?
Yes. So we're comparing the dentist's chair to a submarine.
Yes.
Okay, now listen carefully to the next one, right? I was afraid. I was a captive monkey to be analyzed.
I was afraid.
Is that a metaphor?
Yes.
Why?
Because it has the word was in it.
But are we comparing I was afraid to anything?
No.
No. So, okay, so let's look at the next one. I was a captive monkey to be analyzed. What do you think of that sentence?
That one is was, because they're comparing the boy to a captive monkey.
Exactly. So you see, can you see the difference between that two sentences? Okay. So today is just an introduction to metaphors, right? The rest of the week we'll continue, so you'll get to know it a bit better.
So what we did was, this is actually a long lesson, and we took snippets from this long lesson just to explain the knowledge building that happens here using semantic gravity. So in this lesson, as you can see, which I said previously, was that the learner first explains, she uses similes to write sentences, and she talks about those sentences firstly. And then the teacher launches into the metaphor, and she explains what's the metaphor. So she sets up a constellation of what a metaphor is as a direct comparison of two unlike things. The learner hones in on the word was, because that's what she did for similes. She's looking for a technical identifier rather than a conceptual one. The teacher addresses this misconception by going back to the criteria and uses an example from the story to address the comparison. So that there's a story, and the story is a visit to the dentist, and the teacher reads from the story, and she reads the first line, and the learner picks out the metaphor, and then she'll ask the learner, so what is the comparison here? What is being compared to what? And when she does that, the semantic gravity is weakened. And then sometimes what she'll do is she'll bring in everyday language of the everyday examples of the learner where the semantic gravity will be strengthened. Can we please go on to the next slide? So what I did was the Zoom recordings of this lesson was transcribed. I then created a semantic gravity translation device. And if you look at the vertical axis, I use those categories to analyze and to code the transcript. So when the teacher introduces the metaphor and how it conveys meaning, I say that it's more abstract, so the semantic gravity is weakened. When the teacher unpacks or also packs the direct comparison of the metaphor, the semantic gravity is weak there as well. For example, where the teacher asks the learner, so what is the comparison? What is being compared to what? Is this correct? Or in the example of the was, where the learner got the was incorrect, where she was using honing onto the was, the teacher asked, but what is being compared here, to make us see that you have to compare two unlike things. So when the sentence doesn't have something else that's being compared to it, then we cannot say that that is a metaphor. And when the teacher uses examples from the story, I said the semantic gravity was stronger there, and examples from the learner's life will give the semantic gravity will be much stronger there. Okay, so what I did in this semantic wave is I used the blue to indicate the teacher moves, and I used red to indicate the learner moves. And it was quite amazing in this clip, this interaction between the learner and the teacher, because what the teacher is doing here, she's modeling. She's modeling something to the learner where she asks the learner, okay, I'm going to read the sentence, you pick out the metaphor, now explain to me what the comparison is, okay? And if you see around the area of D, that's where she actually addresses the whole misconception of the was. But what was fascinating here is you can see what happens with the upward escalators in all the red part from the 11th minute going on to the 16th minute, where the teacher has modeled and now the learner is taking over. So the learner is not waiting for the teacher to ask, so what is the comparison here? The learner goes on to say, okay, this is the comparison. This is what is being compared to what. So she's taken over. And this I found totally fascinating with this. So the teacher is modeling particular semantic waves that the learner can eventually do on their own. You can go on to the next slide, please. So learning theorists would term this modeling scaffolding. Next slide, please. And I say that scaffolding has been vaguely defined. There are lots of implications for the child, but not for the teacher. So we have strong theories of learning, but not of teaching. Scaffolding is a useful metaphor, and it has been used for many, many years, for about 40 years. But how does it actually play out in the classroom? I've shown here in my research with the poetic devices, the use of semantic waving is a way of demonstrating the kinds of modeling that help to move the learner from concepts to working with concepts, to exposing their misconceptions, and to help the learner to work independently. And that's what I wanted to investigate here. I wanted to investigate how can teachers help learners to work more independently? So the question I ask here is, could semantic waves perhaps give us a different way of understanding scaffolding, or assist us with understanding scaffolding? Thanks so much.
All right, thank you to all the presenters. That was really fantastic to listen to. I love how each one of us today are all transversing the dilemma of giving our students the sound theoretical underpinnings of each discipline, whilst at the same time allowing them opportunities to make use of those theories in more practical and experiential ways. And also allowing them opportunities to go backwards, or perhaps forwards, I guess, take their practical understandings and give them the tools to make abstractions with complex connections and condensation of meaning. So thank you, Semantics, for giving us this common language where we can compare disciplines and share ideas and share struggles. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I see that we still have 10 minutes left, so I would love to open the floor up for any questions from the audience, or perhaps the participants would like to share any additional insights. Yeah, so I'm handing over the floor to everyone else. Thank you.
We did have some comments in the chat. If the folks who made comments would like to make them vocal now, maybe we could chat about that. Or maybe someone else has got another comment. Rita asked me in the chat about, I've got very rarely, I can never get there. Rita said to me, do you think that you, meaning me, were able to get quite good at the guitar without the theory because you were picking up on some of the music principles tacitly? I think absolutely yes. And the thing is that it's absolutely possible to become a very, very good musician without doing theory of music, without learning how to read notation even. Notation is just a sort of tool. What notation does is it makes concepts visual for us to see. So it provides a kind of language, kind of translation device in a way. But it's completely possible to learn music without formal theory or formal lessons. But as musicians learn, and many traditional musicians learn in a way that they are building up these schema in their heads, so that they're building their own networking of principles, of ideas, of the kind of systems of meaning. And sometimes they might not be, have terminology for them, but they are understood in a more tacit way. So absolutely, yes, that's how many musicians function in the world. It's just not a very practical way to teach when you're in a classroom that's constrained by timetables. But the understanding the two is important, that you can learn very much in a hands-on way, and it is the worldly code is a good way to explain it, because it is complex knowledge, but it's all very much in the kind of experiential realm. I don't know if anyone else has got something that rings true for them in another field.
Hi, thanks Mandy for your explanation. I'm just thinking about how that relates to English literature, where with all the different lenses that I was talking about, where you could perhaps imbibe some of those, principles by just being exposed to the literary works. But I think that would rarely actually occur.
You can, but it takes time. You can. I mean, it's like apprenticeship learning. It's you learn by doing and by seeing and by being exposed, and sort of washes over you, and it's kind of induction or osmosis. Yes, that's how you can learn like that. It's a very effective way to learn. In fact, in music, it's a more musical way to learn, because you are doing it through your ears and not through your eyes or your head. But it's a different way of learning, but it's completely possible to learn that way. And of course, with students, it can be a bit arbitrary as to what are they going to learn? Are they going to pick things up, or are they not?
A comment for Zaheera. I really liked your idea about scaffolding and using semantics to unpack that, because it's kind of ironic, you know, that scaffolding itself is a term that's used so often in education, and that term itself is not always unpacked in, you know, very clear detail in terms of exact guidelines on what that means and what you need to do to scaffold information for your students.
Thanks so much, Rita. Thanks for that. Are you using something similar with your, I'm sorry, I think I missed your presentation.
No worries. I'm looking at an English literature curriculum, and I'm using both specialization and semantics. So I'm still early phases, figuring out which, you know, tools to focus on and where to really put my emphasis. But yeah, scaffolding is a concept that gets thrown around a lot in, you know, my circles in teaching English literature.
Thanks. Yes, it does. Thanks.
There was also a question from Karen Wolf and to Dorian, and I wondered if that would be nice to bring out into the group. If Karen is still with us, says Karen is still there. Yes. Unless she's going to get herself a cup of tea.
She says she's driving.
Okay. Attending a conference by driving. Amazing. It's really cool.
I mean, I think that Dorian's work is really fascinating in that he's developed this really useful kind of way of thinking to make feedback meaningful for his learners. And my husband is a software engineer, and he gets really frustrated when they have new graduates. He loves the new graduates, but sometimes it's so difficult, he says, when they're in the middle of a project and they're rushing towards deadlines and things, and he works for a health insurer. So, you know, when they need the benefit to be working, they need it to be working. For example, with COVID, you know, they needed the stuff to be done, you know, yesterday. And now he's trying to work out ways to mediate to the graduates how to kind of move from here to there, as Dorian was explaining. And I think that, you know, perhaps having this kind of, I suppose, roadmap, kind of intuitively knowing, okay, they're sitting in the, you know, prosaic or whatever, how am I going to move them somewhere else? I think that could be really, really useful, even in kind of a professional situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite odd that a highly developed, you know, theory like LCT can also be quite intuitive and immediate. It's, you kind of need, when you're teaching, you need to live on your instincts, and you don't have time to kind of reason through and develop a complete translation device for this particular kid's project or whatever. You have to have a sort of general sense that will, you know, get you through that moment. And every child is following a different path. You know, some of them are yes, they've learned how to use a variable properly, but they're struggling with the conditionals and things like that. And, you know, how do you use your energy within a classroom? You can't follow the instructional design path. You've got to, while you're walking around the classroom, be able to, you know, speak to that particular kid at that particular moment.
Yeah.
And you need these kind of shorthands, yeah, to help you through those moments, and just a way of conceiving it and thinking of it on the spot.
Yeah, fascinating.
Well, I think we're done, and we're ready to hand over to the for the next session.